Sour beers take a lot of time. It's tricky to do test batches and to iterate because each cycle can take a year. And so while in the last year we've done 15 or 20 IPAs, and each one is ready to drink before the next one is served or brewed.
It's about a 3-week turnaround for most of those 3-4 weeks.
That we really can quickly tweak and adjust water profiles and fermentations and dry hopping, and it honestly also feels like a little bit less of a risk because the beer's gone after 5 or 6 weeks. But we're still at the point where we're just releasing now the first versions of sour beers from here. So we're drinking Opulence today, which is a sour cherry, sour red, aged in 2 bourbon barrels, 1 Pinot Noir barrel. But we also have a special treat, courtesy of me and myself, a beer I called Cherry Wine that was sort of the homebrew precursor to Opulence.
Is this one of the last bottles that you
The
had?
last bottle.
The last bottle.
Yeah. And that beer was a similar concept. Both of these were primary fermented with a red wine strain.
Yep, it was 58W3. This was what, 2-3 years ago when you brewed this beer?
2017.
2017. At the time, I was experimenting with wine yeast and hoppy beers, and it was a strain that I kind of liked on a primary because it left quite a bit of sugars behind. So it means it's a higher final gravity, which gives some of the bugs more to chew on over time.
Particularly the lactic acid bacteria. Brettanomyces will sort of do its thing almost no matter what you leave it with, and Lactobacillus and Pediococcus, on the other hand, really need sugars to convert into lactic acid.
And so the biggest difference between these is obviously no wood in yours.
Mine was just fermented in a carboy. I added dried sour cherries early, and then I transferred off of that onto a blend of sweet dark cherries and fresh sour cherries. Let's just drink that one first on its own.
It's as good as I remember.
Yeah, it's still a really bright, fresh cherry flavor, and considering these were cherries that were harvested the summer of 2018, so already 18 months after the cherries went into the beer, and they still have a real fresh sour cherry pie.
Yeah.
A little bit juicy. I mean, there's not a lot of sweetness there, but.
And the acidity is a nice level. Sometimes I'm a little sensitive to super sour, but this is kind of, even for that first sip, sometimes that first sip kind of whoa, kind of knocks you back.
Particularly having a beer at about 1 o'clock on a Friday.
Oh, you don't have to say that. It's Friday.
Color's real nice too, and it really has a cherry-like color.
The concept of using, I like to kind of compare how we do hoppy beers with some of these sour beers. And so using the dried fruit for long periods during that aging process is kind of, in a way, like adding a whole bunch of whirlpool hops to a hoppy beer.
Yeah.
You're sort of trying to get that base saturated fruitiness, whether it's from actual fruit, to saturate the flavor with that fruit. So then when you're adding the fruit after aging, it's almost like dry hopping a beer. You just one final punch of just that fresh fruit flavor.
And you could use fresh fruit or frozen fruit or any form you want, but dry fruit is nice because it's economical, it's shelf stable, and it's available in last December when we were adding it to this beer, and worked out timing-wise pretty well for 7 or 8 months later to go on to those fresh cherries.
You wouldn't foresee a problem aging fresh fruit for 8 months?
Not a major one. I know some breweries, Wicked Weed is a big advocate of sort of multi-stage fruit additions. You'd certainly extract other things if you leave the pits in there or the seeds for a long time. You could start pulling out some other flavors. It would be more of a logistical issue. For us, we add the dried fruit directly to the barrel. Dried fruit's pretty easy to get in and out of a barrel compared to fresh fruit.
It's a lot easier to get in the barrel.
Certainly. Well, it's easier to get out too than fresh fruit.
You just kind of have to flood them out.
Yeah. It's messy either way.
Right.
We've got screens we put over our barrel transfer tools that allow us to leave the fruit behind, just so a dried cherry doesn't clog something up along the way. And dried fruit honestly has lost a lot of those kind of delicate, fresh, volatile aromatics anyway. And those would probably be driven off by fermentation and oxidation and time and all that. And so better to save the best stuff for very close to the end.
Yep.
In the same way with a hoppy beer, we might use hops that are a year or two old. They're not our favorite bag of hops in the whirlpool because you're going to volatilize a lot of those delicate, varietal, special aromatics.
Those bags that you open that are just really popping and bright, use those post-fermentation almost, literally days before you package it.
Yeah. Let's go on to tasting Opulence. So we picked the name Opulence because opulent is the descriptor, particularly for wines that are really just like jammy and big and bold and fruity, and that's what we were hoping this beer would be.
The vanilla characteristic from the wood is what really differentiates this from yours to me, right on the nose. But
yeah, and that was the thought that like cherry and vanilla is a pretty classic combination, whether it's cherry vanilla Coke or whether
it's almost got that pie type of.
Yeah. Honestly, like a little cinnamon kind of thing too. I think maybe from the oak and the Pinot Noir rather than the bourbon oak is probably what's giving you the vanilla and maybe a little coconut or something like that.
But it's not over the top. We were a little worried sometimes when you put a beer that's not super malt forward into a bourbon
an
barrel.
imperial stout,
The
barley
barrel
wine
can take over, and you just get way too much bourbon. That's not the case here.
Yeah. And that was partly, we filled 5 barrels with the base beer, 3 Pinot Noir and 2 bourbon, so we had some options when the time came. We've just taken one of those, the leftover Pinot Noir, and added it to a dark Saison, so it's not like they're being thrown out or anything, but with a sour beer, it's nice to have those options, whether it's different microbes in the barrel.
Which was the case here. We had different microbes in each barrel, and then we just sat down and you pour samples of everything you have. What are your options?
Yeah.
Sort of starting with, all right, which ones do you like the best, and then kind of play from there. But that's actually a fun process.
Yeah. Yeah, but it really can be early on very intimidating because you have almost unlimited options. The cherries for this were from Bogger's Orchard in Westminster, Maryland.
Westminster, yeah, that was kind of neat. I went and picked them up one afternoon, and it was, how many pounds did I get? I don't even quite remember.
It was some number of buckets, but I think it worked out to about 200 pounds.
You show up and you wait in this big line, and then the truck is coming and going, like they're picking them, bringing them back, and then there's people, 30 people there that just empty the truck, and then they leave and come back, so they're just freshly picked.
Yeah.
So that afternoon, picked them up, we brought them back, just added them to a separate little tote that we have. They're wine, made for wine, and then we put a little filter on a racking arm, so we can just add all the fruit loose, and then
along with one oak barrel.
One oak barrel. Yep. And so the day it was picked, it was the same day it went into the beer, and then it sat for a couple months.
Yeah. And that was one of the differences. Is my homebrew version had dark sweet cherries. I think it was 2-to-1 sour cherry to dark sweet, and this was 100% sour. The problem is with timing fruit is at home it was easy enough for me to freeze 2 or 3 pounds of dark cherries and wait 3 weeks until the sour cherry season hit, or vice versa. I forget which way it was. But here it was like, well, we don't really want to hold on to that much fruit, and it's going to rot before we can do anything. And it just made sense to give it one concentrated thing.
And that's probably why yours is slightly darker, right?
Yeah.
The darker cherries.
That's part of it. Mine also used American malts, Briess Vienna in Munich, where for ours we used Belgian malts. I felt this was lacking a little bit in maltiness. Yeah, so part of what we're trying to do is have different microbes in every barrel. So in this case, we had started out a couple of the barrels with white yeast Roselaire and a couple with East Coast yeast Flemish ale blend. And then we added bottle dregs and whatnot. So sort of essentially anytime we open up a beer that we really enjoy that has a character that might be a little bit reminiscent of what we're looking for, we'll sanitize the top with alcohol, and then we'll pitch those microbes right into the barrel.
That's the best way to get yeast, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Bugs. You get a bottle with them.
Yeah. No, and it's been amazing to us. I used to do like just dregs at home in like a 5-gallon batch. And that sort of made sense that would work, but we've done some barrels that have literally gotten,
We've had
20 or 30 milliliters of yeast slurry from the bottom of a bottle, and a year later it's plenty sour and interesting and funky and sour. And
Right, so to put that in perspective, that's like this much yeast or bacteria going into 60 gallons of beer and completely changing it over the course of a year.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a little bit slower than it would be at home. One of the barrels that we did that for with this, when we got to blending after 8 or 9 months, it wasn't quite there, but now we just used it in a beer and it's still less than a year old and plenty sour and interesting.
That's what's fun about these beers. So if you remember tasting these about 4 or 5 months in,
Yeah.
I was getting a little worried. I'm like, well, there's no acidity. They're not really doing a whole lot.
Yeah.
And then once the weather started warming up and in the back, it gets to about, what did we set, about 80 degrees or something. And then it really sort of, that warmer weather just kind of kicks everything into gear a little bit.
Yeah, and it sort of worked out well timing-wise. It certainly would be nice to have year-round temperature control that at mid to high 60s, but in the winter it's a little bit cooler than that. In the summer it's a little bit warmer, but at least we do have air conditioning and we don't have 95 degrees.
You're just trying to prevent the extremes on each end. So you don't want it to get too cold, you don't want it to get too warm.
Yeah. Yeah, and comparing the beers, they're both good beers. It's clearly, and we knew going into it, we weren't trying to make the same beer.
It's almost impossible to, and there's so much unknown.
Yeah,
with
and
where
not
those
to
are
mention,
gonna go.
adding barrels, removing fruit, changing the malts, changing the microbes
Right,
we
it's
were
not the
using.
same beer.
Yeah. I enjoy both of them. The Opulence, I think, is a little bit more nuanced thanks to the oak,
The wood,
the wood. Similar levels of acidity, I would say. Mine might be a little, the cherry wine might be a little
more.
zippier.
And yours is just a little more fruit saturated, I think, in the flavor.
I think part of that is just the absence of the oak, that you don't have anything else that's sort of
Competing,
merging
not necessarily
in,
competing, but
No, it
that
is.
is factoring in.
Yeah,
They're both pretty awesome.
yeah. We're sold out of these bottles to go at this point, but we have some bottles left that are tasting room only, and we're holding on to vintage bottles of everything so that hopefully next year when a similar beer may or may not be out, we could release a little of that.
Right. It's fun for us to finally have these come out.
Yeah.
Right when we opened, we'd had quite a few people that would come in and they were like, I thought you guys were a sour brewery. Like, where
Yeah,
are
why
the
you
sour-
only have two
where's all
on?
the- yeah, like we did. We had some what we consider like quicker sours where they're not.
Berliner Weiss, mixed fermentation, no
Yeah.
boil. Not kettle sours, but relatively quick.
Right,
Mixed ferment
compared
saison.
It was like, just wait, it takes about a year, but now
Yeah.
we're finally, we just had our 1-year anniversary in late September.
Yeah.
And now we're building up a good
Yeah, almost every month
pipeline
something new.
of
Yeah.
barrels, and so now we can keep putting these out, which is
Yeah.
going to be fun this coming year.
Yeah, and so we've got dark saison elliptical orbit coming out on Black Friday, and we've got peach nectarine sour already in bottles, and
And then we got a lot of question marks for what we want to do with all the other barrels.
yeah.
But I think these turned out pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy with our first 4 releases so far
Yeah.
from the barrels, and
Yeah, they've all carbonated, and they've all eventually, in some cases. This one took a little bit of time.